My boyfriend screamed that I was too masculine, demanded I become his perfect feminine fantasy, so I gave him exactly what he asked for, and then watched every single piece of his life fall apart. I was on my back under the kitchen sink when I heard his car door slam outside. Water dripped onto my forehead. The pipe joint had been weeping for 3 days, and I'd finally gotten under there with a basin wrench and a roll of Teflon tape to fix it myself, instead of waiting for the building super to show up sometime between Tuesday and next month. The front door banged open. Dana, I didn't move. Under here, almost done. Tyler's shoes stopped next to the cabinet. I could see them through the gap under the sink skirt, planted wide, not moving toward me to help, not moving away either. Of course you are. I finished tightening the slip nut, wiped my hands on a rag, and slid out from under the sink. My hair was stuck to my forehead. There was a smear of old pipe grease on my forearm. Tyler was standing in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, jaw tight, staring at me like I'd done something to him personally. What? Look at you. He said it like an accusation. You look like you climbed out of an oil pan. I fixed the sink, Tyler. It's been leaking since Thursday. You could have called someone. I did call someone. Me. It took 20 minutes and cost $4 in parts. He dropped his bag on the counter harder than he needed to. This is what I'm talking about. This is exactly what I'm talking about. What are you talking about? You, his voice climbed. The jeans, the boots, the way you talk to the mechanic like you're one of the guys, the way you just fixed a sink instead of acting like it's a problem, like it's something you need help with. You don't need anything from me. Do you know what that's like? To watch you sail through every single thing like you don't even register that I'm a man in this relationship? I set the wrench down on the counter, very carefully, because my hands wanted to do something else with it. You want me to act helpless about a leaking pipe. I want you to be feminine for once. The words came out fast, like he'd been holding them for a long time, and the dam had finally gone. Stop acting like you're not even a woman half the time. How am I supposed to want someone who handles everything like she's basically a man? The kitchen went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed in another unit. I looked at him, 31 years old, still in his lanyard from Brannigan Freight, breathing like he'd just run somewhere, and I felt something in my chest go still and cold and clear, the way water gets right before it freezes. I picked the wrench back up, walked it to the toolbox under the hall closet, and set it inside without a sound. You want feminine? I said. Fine, you'll get feminine. He laughed, short and disbelieving, already turning away toward the fridge like the conversation was over and he'd won something. He had no idea what he'd just started. I want to be honest about something before I go any further. I didn't smile that night the way people online have imagined it when I've told pieces of this story before. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief. If grief can arrive 3 years early, right on schedule, the way it does when you finally understand what someone has been trying to tell you about themselves the whole time you love them. But grief doesn't mean you don't act. It just means you know exactly what you're giving up when you do. To understand how we got to that kitchen, you have to understand who Tyler Voss was before he became the person standing in that doorway, and who I was before I became the woman who decided, calmly, to burn her own relationship down from the inside rather than shrink 1 more inch. I was 26 when I met him, working my second year as a mechanical engineer at Linwood Industrial Fabrication on the east side of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, doing tolerance checks on conveyor assemblies for a client in Waterloo. I'd gone into Denny's Hardware on a Saturday afternoon to buy a torque wrench for a project at my parents' house, and Tyler was 3 aisles over, holding 2 paint swatches up to the light like they'd tell him something, looking lost in the way some men look lost in hardware stores like the building itself was hostile territory. He asked me, half joking, if I actually knew what I was buying or if I was just trying to look tough. I told him the wrench was rated to 40 foot-pounds, and I needed it to set lug nuts on my dad's trailer, and if he wanted, I could tell him which of his 2 paint colors would actually look different from the other one, because they were the same color under 2 different names. He laughed. We ended up getting coffee 2 aisles over at the little kiosk by the exit, and by the time I left, I had his number written on the receipt for my wrench. For the first year, it was good. Genuinely, unremarkably good. He worked in regional sales at Brannigan Freight and Logistics, a mid-sized trucking company headquartered off I-380, and he was funny in a self-deprecating way, and he liked that I could talk about torque specs, and also liked that I laughed at his terrible jokes about it. We moved in together 14 months before that night in the kitchen, into a 2-bedroom unit at Maplecrest Apartments on 3rd Avenue SE. We split the lease 60-40 because he made more. I built the bookshelves. He picked the paint, the real color this time, a warm gray he'd agonized over for a week. I don't say any of this to make him sound like a monster from day one. He wasn't. That's the part people skip when they tell stories like this one, the part that actually matters. If he'd been cruel from the beginning, I would have left in month 2. What happened instead was slower, and it had a shape, and once I learned to see the shape, I could trace it all the way back. The clearest early marker was his father. Ed Voss was a heavy equipment dealer outside Marion, a big, loud man who called his wife the boss, in a tone that made it very clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. I met him twice. Both times he made some comment about Carol, Tyler's mother, being too independent for her own good, usually right in front of her, usually followed by a laugh that expected everyone else to laugh too. Carol always did. I watched Tyler watch that exchange both times, and I watched something in his face that I mistook back then for discomfort. I understand now it was something closer to inheritance. The incident that should have told me everything happened 8 months before that night in the kitchen. kitchen, at his cousin Megan's wedding at a barn venue outside Cedar Rapids called Cedar Hollow. I wore a charcoal suit instead of a dress because I don't own dresses that don't make me feel like I'm wearing a costume, and because Megan herself had told me, laughing, that she loved it when I texted her a picture beforehand. Halfway through the reception, the DJ's monitor speaker started cutting out, a bad XLR connection, and I happened to be standing right there with nothing better to do, so I popped the cable, reseated the pin, and taped it down before the DJ had even finished apologizing to the room. Tyler pulled me aside 20 minutes later, by the gift table, his voice low and furious. Could you not for one night just be a normal woman? I didn't understand the question. I still half don't. I fixed a cable, Tyler. You made a scene. Nobody even noticed except the DJ. I noticed. He said it like that settled it. Like his noticing was the only variable in the room that mattered. His mother overheard the tail end of it and pulled him aside near the bar, and I watched her say something sharp to him, her mouth tight, her eyes flicking toward me with something like apology. He brushed her off with a shrug and a joke and came back to the table smiling like nothing had happened, and I let it go, because that's what you do when you love someone and you've decided, without quite admitting you've decided it, that the good months outweigh the bad 5 minutes. I want to be honest about my own blind spot here too. I am, by training and by temperament, someone who solves problems. Give me a system that's misbehaving, and I will find the failure point. What I didn't do, for a long time, was apply that same rigor to the relationship itself. I kept treating Tyler's outbursts as isolated incidents instead of data points in a pattern, because admitting they were a pattern would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit yet, which was that the man I loved had a blueprint for the kind of woman he actually wanted, and I did not match it, and never would. Not really. Not without stopping being myself. There was an earlier version of the wedding incident too, one I'd nearly forgotten until I started laying all of this out in order. Brannigan Freight's holiday party, 18 months into the relationship, held at a hotel ballroom downtown. Tyler had asked me a week beforehand to dress up nice, and I'd taken that seriously. A tailored charcoal pantsuit, my hair actually done, the whole effort. At the party, one of his coworkers' wives, a woman named Sherry, complimented the suit twice, told me she wished she had the shoulders to pull off a cut like that. Tyler smiled through the whole exchange. In the car afterward, though, he went quiet for 3 full minutes before saying, almost to himself, that he'd pictured me in something else that night, something he didn't specify, and that it wasn't a big deal. Forget he'd said anything. I did forget, or told myself I had. I didn't clock it as anything more than a passing preference, a man having a fleeting idea about a dress and letting it go. I understand now that it was the blueprint's first draft, sketched out 18 months before he ever said the word feminine out loud, and that everything after it, the wedding, the sink, the kitchen, was just him filling in the same outline a little more each time, waiting for me to catch up to a version of myself I'd never agreed to become. By the time we got to the kitchen that night, 3 years in, the pattern had a name I just hadn't said out loud. The jeans, the bare nails, the sink. Small things, individually. A shape, together. So when he said the words, be feminine for once, stop acting like you're not even a woman half the time, I didn't hear a new complaint. I heard the whole blueprint laid out on the table at last, specific enough, finally, to build from. I decided to build exactly what he'd asked for. The next morning was his mother's monthly family brunch, held the second Sunday of every month at Carol and Ed's house in Marion, a standing tradition I'd attended maybe 30 times without incident. I told Tyler I needed extra time to get ready. He said fine. He'd head over and hold a seat. I spent 4 hours in the bathroom. I'm not exaggerating for effect. 4 hours. Lash curling I had to redo twice because I kept pinching my eyelid. 3 full attempts at a French manicure because the first 2 smudged before they dried. A wardrobe change from a blush pink wrap dress to a different blush pink wrap dress because the first one, I decided out loud to my own reflection, didn't feel delicate enough. Tyler texted at the 90-minute mark asking where I was. I told him I wanted to look nice for his family. He didn't argue with that. He couldn't. Not without contradicting himself in writing. I walked into Carol's dining room 2 hours late, mid-meal, apologizing in a soft voice I'd practiced in the car, and took the seat that had been left for me at the far end of the table, next to his cousin's husband, who I'd never once been seated next to in 3 years of brunches. Carol pulled me into the kitchen 20 minutes later under the pretense of helping refill the coffee. Honey, she had her hand on my arm, and her eyes were doing a slow, worried scan of my face, my dress, my hands. Is everything okay? You've never been late before. Tyler said you'd been in the bathroom since he got up. A pause. Is he making you feel like you need to look a certain way to come here? I told her everything was wonderful, that I just wanted to make an effort. My voice pitched a half step higher than my own, and I watched her not believe a word of it, and I watched her decide, for now, not to push. She refilled the carafe herself and gave my arm one more squeeze before we walked back out, and I understood, watching Tyler across the table making strained small talk with his uncle, that the pressure in the room that day hadn't landed on me at all. It had landed entirely on him. That was the first data point. It wouldn't be the last. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The next escalation came the following Thursday, during his weekly game night with the guys from his fantasy football league. 6 of them rotated houses. It was our turn to host. I'd normally sit in with a beer and heckle whoever was losing. Instead, I served snacks and a soft soft voice I could barely hear myself use, flinching visibly every time someone cheered too loud at the TV, tucking myself against the doorframe like the noise physically hurt. Jason Pham, Tyler's best friend since college, caught my eye at one point during a particularly loud third-quarter comeback and asked, half laughing, if I was doing bit for a joke I wasn't in on. I told him softly that I just wasn't used to so much shouting. He didn't laugh again. He watched me flinch 2 more times before the night was over, and I watched him watch Tyler with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before, something between confusion and concern. Jason didn't come to the next game night, or the one after that. Tyler mentioned it to me almost a month later, irritated, scrolling through a group text where Jason had made an excuse about work. He's been weird lately, Tyler said, ever since, I don't even know when. He used to come to everything. I didn't say anything. I'd stopped needing to. The helplessness didn't stay contained to social settings. I stopped calling the mechanic, the landlord, the cable company, anyone who required what I now performed as an inability to handle confrontation. Tyler picked up all of it instead, because someone had to, and because he'd made it very clear in that kitchen that handling things myself was the entire problem. Within 2 weeks, he was fielding calls from our landlord about a broken garbage disposal, sitting on hold with the internet provider for 40 minutes on a Tuesday night, driving out to deal with a parking citation dispute that used to take me 15 minutes on my lunch break. This is costing me actual time, he said one night, rubbing his eyes at the kitchen table, a stack of paperwork from the leasing office in front of him. I had to leave the office early for the landlord thing. That's hours I'm not billing, Dana. That adds up. That's real money if you want to talk about the Cancun trip we've been saving for. You wanted me to stop handling things myself, I said, my voice still soft, still careful. I'm just doing what you asked. He didn't have an answer for that. He never did. Not really. Not out loud. He'd just get a look on his face like he was doing long division in his head and not liking the remainder and change the subject. The gym trainer happened around the same time. I still went at 5 most mornings, but now I went in full makeup because heavy machinery apparently wasn't feminine either, according to a comment Tyler had made about my old gym clothes the week before, so Tyler had started driving me there before his own workday, since I'd also, quietly, stopped driving myself anywhere. A trainer named Colton, 20-something, Ernest, offered me 3 free sessions unprompted, telling me it was honestly refreshing to see someone put effort into looking put together, even at 5 in the morning. At the coffee shop 2 blocks from Linwood, a barista started writing tiny compliments on my cup in Sharpie most mornings. Nothing that crossed a real line, just little notes, brightened my whole shift, that kind of thing. And Tyler saw one of them on the counter one Saturday, and went quiet in a way that had a texture to it I hadn't felt from him before. Not anger exactly, something closer to fear. Do you know what it's like? He said later that night, staring at the ceiling instead of at me, to watch some guy leave a note on your girlfriend's coffee every single day, to watch a trainer offer you free sessions like you're some kind of... He stopped himself. You wanted this attention. Don't pretend you don't like it. You're the one who wanted me feminine, I said. This is what happens when I stop pushing people away. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I didn't answer that because we both knew it was exactly what he'd meant, whether he could admit it to himself or not. What he'd wanted was a version of me that was soft only for him, decorative only for him. And instead, the softness had gone out into the world, and the world had responded to it the way the world responds to anyone who looks like they need rescuing. He hadn't accounted for the fact that he wasn't the only man capable of noticing. My own mother, Linda, came up from Iowa City for a weekend around this same stretch, and I watched the tactic shift shape one more time, aimed somewhere I hadn't expected it to go. I kept the voice soft the whole visit, kept flinching, kept deferring every decision, where to eat, what movie to watch. Back to Tyler with a little apologetic laugh. My mother noticed within about 6 hours. She pulled me into the guest room Saturday night, sat me down on the edge of the bed, and asked, point blank, if Tyler had said something to make me feel like I couldn't speak up for myself anymore. Before I could answer, Tyler knocked and let himself in, said he'd heard voices and just wanted to check I was okay, and then, standing in the doorway, told my own mother that he'd been a little worried about me too lately, that I'd seemed anxious and withdrawn for weeks, and he didn't know what was causing it, that he was glad she'd noticed it too because at least now he knew he wasn't imagining things. He said it gently. He said it like a man asking for backup, not a man laying groundwork. My mother's face softened toward him in a way that made my stomach drop, because I understood, watching it happen, that he'd just recruited her onto his side of a story she didn't know she was in, using the exact same voice of concern he'd used on Denise, on Carol, on anyone who might one day need to vouch for how patient and worried he'd been through all of this. It was the same move as the group text about Jason weeks earlier, the same quiet campaign to make sure that if this ever blew up in public, there would already be a chorus of people ready to describe him as the steady one and me as the one who'd come undone. I didn't correct him in front of her. I thanked him for the concern softly and let him leave the room satisfied. Once the door clicked shut, my mother looked at me for a long moment and said only, I don't like how that man watches you. I didn't tell her everything that night, but I told her enough to make sure that when I did call her from the Linwood parking lot weeks later, she wouldn't need much explanation at all. Around this time, I started catching small things that didn't fit the pattern of complaints and irritation I'd otherwise come to expect from him. He'd close his laptop fast when I walked into the room, the screen going dark a half second before I could see it. Once, waiting for him to bring me a glass of water. I glanced at his phone lying face up on the couch and caught the tail end of a browser tab title before the screen locked, something with the word Providence in it, and thought nothing of it. Filed it away the way you file away a word you don't recognize in a language you don't speak. A co-worker of his, a guy named Marcus from the Waterloo branch, texted him something once that Tyler read and then laughed at privately, alone, in a way that had an edge to it, and when I asked what was funny, he said, "Nothing, work stuff too quickly for it to actually be nothing." And then there was the camera. 3 weeks into all of this, a package addressed to me, a birthday gift from my mother mailed early, went missing from the hallway outside our unit. Tyler was furious about it, more furious than the situation seemed to call for, and within 2 days he'd installed a small indoor camera on the entertainment center, angled at the living room and the front door, a brand called Hearthguard that promised motion alerts straight to your phone. "For our safety," he said, mounting it himself, which struck me at the time as almost sweet, a rare moment of him doing something protective without being asked. I didn't think about it again. I want to be honest about that. I let it become furniture. The barbecue was the moment his career started to feel the pressure directly, and it was the moment I understood exactly how far this was going to have to go. It was a company event, hosted at Denise Ferraro's house, Denise being the VP of sales at Brannigan Freight, the person who'd ultimately decide who got the district manager promotion Tyler had been chasing for 2 years. I wore heels tall enough that walking on the grass required actual strategy, and I clung to Tyler's arm the entire afternoon, gasping softly every time a man I didn't know walked within 6 feet of us, apologizing in a whisper for being so nervous around people. Denise's husband, a broad, friendly man named Craig, tried to shake my hand when we were introduced, and I flinched back into Tyler's side and murmured that I wasn't really comfortable touching men I hadn't been introduced to properly, my eyes down, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 full seconds. It felt longer. Denise pulled Tyler aside near the drink table about 20 minutes later. I watched from across the yard, holding a paper plate I wasn't eating from, while her mouth moved in short, clipped sentences, and Tyler's face went through several colors. I found out what she'd said 2 days later, secondhand, from an email Tyler left open on the shared laptop we sometimes both used for streaming. An internal HR flag, informal, the kind that gets logged as a check-in rather than a complaint, asking whether anyone in his reporting chain had concerns about his home life that might be affecting his presentation at company functions. It wasn't a complaint about me. It was a complaint structurally about him, about what his home life apparently looked like from the outside now, and whether that reflected some instability HR needed to keep an eye on before handing him a district-level role with more visibility and more client-facing dinners exactly like this one. He came home that night, rigid with fury he tried to keep controlled. "Do you understand what you almost cost me today?" His voice was low, which was somehow worse than shouting. "Denise thinks I've turned my girlfriend into someone who can't function at a barbecue. That's my promotion, Dana. That's the house we talked about. That's everything. I did exactly what you asked me to do," I said, setting my purse down with careful, deliberate softness, the way I'd practiced. "You wanted feminine. Feminine women don't shake strange men's hands. I read that somewhere. I thought you'd be proud. Don't be smart with me right now. I'm being exactly as smart as you told me to stop being." He didn't have a response to that either. He went to bed angry and didn't speak to me for most of the next day, which I noted clinically as the first time in 3 years he'd gone silent on me instead of pushing for the last word. Something in him had started keeping score differently. I didn't know yet what he was keeping score for. I know now. The last step before the dinner that finally broke everything open was the apartment itself. Over about 10 days, I turned our apartment pink. Not a metaphor, actually pink. A frilled apron I found at a kitchen boutique downtown, pink dish gloves, lace trim I hot glued to the edge of our plain white kitchen curtains at 2 in the morning while Tyler slept, humming to myself, genuinely a little delighted by my own commitment to the bit. I bought pink trash bags because I found a brand that made them, which I did not know was a real product category until I went looking for one out of spite. Dinner, every night that week, took close to 2 hours to prepare because I plated everything with the kind of fussy, decorative precision that made a simple chicken breast look like a magazine spread, and I refused to rush it, no matter how hungry either of us was, because rushing wasn't feminine. Tyler's younger brother, Kyle, came by to borrow a ladder one afternoon during this stretch and stood in our living room for a full 30 seconds just looking around before he pulled out his phone and took a picture of the pink dish towels folded into precise triangles on the oven handle. "This is unreal," he said, laughing, already texting it to someone. "What happened to you guys?" I found out later he'd sent it to their mother with the caption, "Look what Tyler did to Dana." And Carol had called Tyler directly that same night, her voice audible even from across the room, asking him in a tone I'd never heard her use before what exactly he thought he was doing to me. Meanwhile, our neighbor, Brett Callahan, who lived 2 doors down at Maple Crest and, as it turned out, worked in the same regional sales division as Tyler at Brannigan Freight, had started finding reasons to be around. He carried my grocery bags up from the car twice that week without being asked. He knocked on our door to return a package that had been misdelivered to his unit and stayed at the doorway for 10 minutes, telling Tyler, in a friendly, needling voice, that real men cherished feminine women instead of running them ragged with errands and chauffeuring. Tyler stood there and took it, jaw working, because Brett outranked him socially in that specific moment. moment, in a way he had no tools to fight back against without confirming everything Brett was implying. The district manager decision came down at a dinner Denise hosted the following Friday at a steakhouse downtown, the kind of dinner where promotions get informally blessed before the paperwork catches up. I wore the heels again. I refused, sweetly, apologetically, to shake Denise's hand when we arrived, murmuring something about ladylike women not touching men who weren't their husbands, which technically wasn't even about Denise, but the confusion it caused rippled through the whole table anyway. Denise's face did something complicated. Craig beside her looked at Tyler like he was reassessing a business partner mid-handshake. Brett, seated 2 chairs down, spent the entire dinner pulling out my chair, refilling my water before I'd finished it, telling the table how refreshing it was to meet a woman who still had that kind of old-fashioned grace. By dessert, Denise was laughing at his jokes and largely ignoring Tyler's attempts to steer the conversation back toward his numbers for the quarter. The promotion went to Brett. Tyler found out by email 2 days later, a Sunday morning, standing in our kitchen in his boxers with his phone in his hand, and I watched 3 years of ambition collapse across his face in real time. "You've ruined everything," he said. And this time he did shout, loud enough that I heard the unit next door go quiet, listening. "Everyone at my office thinks I'm some controlling freak who broke his own girlfriend. Denise gave Brett my promotion because of you. It's not an act," I said, applying a face mask at the bathroom counter, my third of the day, my voice perfectly level. "You wanted feminine. This is who I am now." His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, and something in his expression shifted. His mother, texting that she'd seen me having coffee downtown that week with Brett, who'd apparently been telling mutual friends he wanted to rescue me from whatever was happening in our apartment. "Brett asked me to dinner," I said, not looking up from the mirror, working the mask into my cheekbones. "Honestly, I might just drop this whole feminine thing and be single. Turns out I have options now that everyone thinks you're the monster who broke me." I meant it as the final blow. I expected rage. I'd built for rage. 3 weeks of careful architecture aimed at provoking exactly that. What I got instead was worse. Tyler went completely still. The fury drained out of his face and something colder moved in behind it. Something patient and awake in a way I hadn't seen from him in 3 years together. "You think you won?" His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "You have no idea what you started." He walked past me into the living room and sat down at his laptop. I followed, wiping mask residue off my fingers with a towel, my pulse picking up in a way I didn't let show on my face. He typed for almost a full minute without looking at me, and then he turned the screen around. A folder, my name as the title. Today's date stamped in the corner. He clicked it open, and it kept opening. Subfolder after subfolder, dozens of files spilling across the screen, screenshots of me at the barbecue, at brunch, in the pink kitchen, side-by-side comparisons labeled before and after in a clean, deliberate font, audio clips. He played one before I could stop him. My own real voice, unguarded, laughing at something on the phone with my sister 2 weeks earlier, from a room he wasn't supposed to have been in. He'd been documenting everything. The whole time I thought I was the only one running an experiment. He'd been running one of his own. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I want to walk you through exactly what I understood in the next 90 seconds, because it happened fast, and because getting it wrong would have cost me everything I built afterward. The dates. That was the first thing I noticed. Scrolling past his shoulder while he clicked through file after file like he wanted me to see all of it, like the horror on my face was the point. The earliest folder wasn't from 3 weeks ago, when I'd started the transformation. It was dated 8 months back, the same week as Megan's wedding, the same week he'd hissed at me by the gift table to be a normal woman for once, the same week his mother had pulled him aside at the bar with her mouth set in a hard line. He hadn't started documenting me because I'd gone strange on him. He'd started documenting me before any of this began, back when I was just wearing a suit to a wedding and fixing a DJ cable. Whatever this folder was, it had never been a reaction. It was a plan that predated the thing it claimed to be reacting to. The second thing I understood was the browser tab I'd glimpsed weeks earlier. Providence, half a word on a locked screen. He clicked, almost absent-mindedly, to close one window, and for half a second, a forum thread was visible behind it, a page titled The Providence Circle, a members-only board attached to a paid coaching program run by a self-styled relationship strategist named Grant Holloway, one of those men who sold 4-figure courses on engineering feminine compliance to guys convinced their girlfriends had gotten away from them somehow. Tyler had paid $2,400 for it 14 months earlier, right around the time we'd signed our lease at Maple Crest. I know the exact number because I found the receipt later, buried in an email search, a line item from a company called Providence Strategic Coaching LLC. The forum thread had a title, Project Reset, Month 8 Update. I only caught a few lines before he closed it, but they were enough. He'd posted the barbecue story to the group 4 days earlier, describing my flinch at Craig's handshake as phase progressing exactly on schedule, and a dozen other men had replied with what I can only describe as approval, one of them writing that he should be proud of how far he'd broken her down without her even noticing. Another comment, from a user with the same handle Tyler used for his fantasy football league, a detail that would matter enormously later, said he couldn't wait to see the final video Tyler had promised the group once he found the right moment to post it. The final video. I understood, standing there in my bathrobe with mask residue still still drying at my hairline, that Tyler hadn't shown me this folder to win an argument. He'd shown it to me because he'd already decided what came next. And some part of him, some cold, patient, calculating part I'd never had reason to meet before that morning, wanted me to know he'd already decided it before I did. I scrolled further before he thought to stop me, and what I saw in that last stretch of visible replies was worse than the barbecue post. Other men on the thread had started asking Tyler for advice, treating his progress with me as a working method rather than a relationship. One user, handle unreadable, had written that he was going to try the same approach on his own girlfriend, starting with the small tasks first, like Tyler did, and Tyler had replied with a numbered list, 4 steps. My sync was step 1 on that list, though he hadn't named it that plainly, just described it as removing her sense that she can solve problems without you. Grant Holloway himself had chimed in near the bottom with a single line of praise, calling Tyler a model member. And I remember standing there thinking, absurdly, that I'd been reduced to a case study with my own dedicated thread on a website I would never have found on my own in 1,000 years of looking. For one disorienting second, standing in that living room, I doubted myself completely. Not about what he'd done, that part was right there on the screen, undeniable, but about what I'd done, whether the last 3 weeks made me complicit in some way, whether giving him exactly what he'd asked for had somehow fed the exact machine he was running, given him more material, more progress to report back to men who were cheering him on for breaking me. It took me the better part of that night, lying awake next to him, breathing evenly, pretending to sleep, to work through that thought all the way to its end and land somewhere solid. I hadn't built the machine. I'd simply held up a mirror to it, close enough that even he couldn't misread what he was looking at anymore. The difference mattered. It still does. I want to tell you I stayed perfectly composed in that moment, but that wouldn't be honest. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, from the specific, disorienting vertigo of realizing that the man across from me had never once, in 8 months, been reacting to anything I did. I had thought I was the one running an experiment on him. It turned out we'd been running parallel experiments the whole time, and his had started first, and his had a name and a paid coach, and an audience of other men cheering him on from a forum I'd never heard of. He closed the laptop with one sharp click. "We need to talk," he said, "about consequences." I did the only thing I could think to do in that second, which was keep the mask up. I giggled, soft and confused, tilting my head the way I'd practiced for 2 months, and told him I didn't understand what any of that meant, that it looked scary, that I didn't like all those numbers and pictures. He just watched me, unreadable, patient, the way you watch something you believe you've already caught. I asked to use the bathroom. He let me. I locked the door, sat down on the edge of the tub, and texted my closest friend from Linwood, a fellow engineer named Priya Anand. One line: "I need you to come get me, and I need you to bring your laptop." Then I did something Tyler hadn't planned for, because Tyler, for all his documentation, had made one mistake that undid the entire architecture of what he'd built. Forum posts on sites like Providence Circle don't disappear the moment someone wants them to. Search engines cache pages. Screenshots exist the second someone else takes them. And usernames. The same lazy, reused username across a fantasy football league. A forum for men who wanted to break their girlfriends down. And, I would find out within the hour, his own work Slack handle. Are traceable in ways anonymous men on the internet apparently forget when they're 14 months deep into believing no one is paying attention. I spent the next 20 minutes locked in that bathroom with my phone, screenshotting everything I could reach through the cached version of the page Priya sent me once she got a search engine crawl pulled up on her end, forwarding it to my own email, forwarding it to hers as backup. I didn't confront him again that day. I smiled, apologized for being so overwhelmed, and told him I needed to lie down. He let me. He thought he'd won. He had no idea I'd just started building a folder of my own. For the next 9 days, I did something that cost me more than almost anything else in this whole story. I kept performing. I kept the soft voice. I kept flinching at loud noises. I let him believe the folder had worked exactly as intended, that I was cowed, recalibrating, wondering what consequences might mean. Underneath it, I was doing 3 things at once. Meeting Priya after work to build out a timeline of everything I could document. Sitting across from an attorney named Rachel Byrne who specialized in tenancy and privacy law, and confirmed calmly that a hidden camera recording audio inside a shared residence without my knowledge sat in genuinely murky legal territory in Iowa, murky enough that a cease and desist letter backed by the threat of a civil claim would very likely make a man like Tyler back down fast, and quietly telling my mother in a phone call I made from my car in the Linwood parking lot that something had happened and I might need her guest room sooner than either of us expected. The confrontation happened 9 days later at Carol's birthday dinner, which neither Tyler nor I could skip without questions we weren't ready to answer yet. I chose that setting deliberately. Tyler had shown me his folder in private, where only I could feel the weight of it. I intended to show mine somewhere he couldn't control the room. 16 people sat around Carol's dining table that night, Ed at the head, Kyle and his fiancée, Megan and her new husband, a scattering of cousins, and in a coincidence Carol herself had arranged without knowing what she was walking into, Brett, who'd been invited months earlier as Tyler's new office rival, and, awkwardly, the man Tyler had spent weeks accusing me of wanting. Dinner had just reached the lull between the main course and the cake when Tyler, 2 glasses of wine in, made a comment across the table about how some people people had been acting strange lately, glancing at me with a small, private smile that told everyone but me it was meant as a joke. Only he understood. It was the same move from the folder, testing whether I still felt the leash. "Since we're talking about strange," I said, setting down my fork, "I think everyone should hear about a website called the Providence Circle." The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses, before it understands, that something real is about to happen. I laid it out plainly. No shaking in my voice this time. I'd rehearsed it in the car, the same way I'd once rehearsed the soft giggle. I told them about the folder. I told them about the 8-month timeline that started at Megan's own wedding. I read, from my phone, 3 lines from his own forum post about the barbecue, about Craig's handshake, about Faye's progressing exactly on schedule. I told them about the $2,400 paid to a man named Grant Holloway to teach him how to, in his own words from another post I'd screenshotted, reset a woman who's forgotten her place. "You've been recording me," I said, looking at Tyler directly for the first time since I'd started talking, since before I ever changed anything. "You didn't react to me. You built a plan and then complained about the wife you hadn't even met yet." Carol's fork hit her plate. Ed, at the head of the table, when a shade of red I hadn't seen on him before. Megan looked at her husband, then at me, then said, quietly but clearly enough for the whole table to hear, "Oh my God, the wedding. That's what that was about." "That's not," Tyler's voice cracked on the second word, all the coldness from the bathroom 9 days earlier gone, replaced by something scrambling and exposed. "You're twisting this. That forum is a joke. It's guys venting. It's not. Read your own words, Tyler." I turned my phone around so Carol could see it, then passed it down the table, past Ed, past Kyle, into Megan's hands, watching each face change as the screenshots moved past them. "Or I can read them for you again. Which post do you want me to start with? The one about Faye's progressing on schedule, or the one about the final video you promised them?" "What video?" Brett's voice from down the table, flat and suddenly very still. I looked at Tyler. He looked back at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. Not remorse, not even shame yet, just the specific, naked panic of a man watching every room he's ever controlled realize, all at once, exactly what he'd been doing in the dark. "I need you to understand something," I said, and I kept my voice even, because this was the part I needed him and everyone at that table to hear exactly once, clearly, without a tremor in it. "You asked for feminine. I gave you feminine. Every single humiliating thing that happened to your career this month happened because you asked a woman who'd never lied to you in 3 years to start performing a lie, and then you built a secret file to punish her for performing it too well. That's not my failure, Tyler. That's the whole shape of who you are, laid out in 8 months of your own handwriting." Megan's husband, Ryan, who'd only met Tyler a handful of times, set down his own fork and asked the question I think everyone else at the table was too stunned to ask first. "Wait, you paid someone money to teach you how to do this?" He wasn't being rhetorical. He wanted an actual number, an actual answer, the way you'd ask someone to explain a number on a spreadsheet that didn't reconcile. It's a coaching program. It's about communication. It's not what she's making it sound like." Tyler's voice had lost its earlier authority completely. He looked for the first time in 3 years genuinely young, like a boy caught rather than a man cornered. "You called it resetting a woman who's forgotten her place," I said. "I have the screenshot. Do you want me to read it out loud to Ryan specifically since he asked?" He didn't answer. Kyle, further down the table, had his phone out now too, thumb moving, and I understood he was pulling up the forum himself in real time, finding out exactly how far back the account went without needing me to walk him through it. "Month 8, he said quietly, mostly to himself, then looked up at his brother. "There's a month 1. You've been doing this since before the wedding, Ty." Nobody at the table said anything for what felt like a very long time. Carol was the first to move. She stood, walked around the table, and put her hand on my shoulder, not Tyler's. "I want you to stay here tonight," she said quietly, "not there. Here." I did. The 48 hours after Carol's dinner moved faster than anything else in this story. Kyle, who'd taken the picture of our pink dish towels months earlier without understanding what he was documenting, found the Providence Circle thread himself that same night and sent screenshots of Tyler's older posts, going back further than even I'd found, nearly a year, to Jason, who'd already been quietly pulling away for weeks without knowing why. Jason called Tyler directly. I don't know everything that was said, only what Jason later told me, that he asked Tyler point blank whether the weird stuff at their last game night, my flinching in the doorway, had been staged for an audience of strangers on a forum, and that Tyler's answer, a long silence followed by, "It's not that simple," was answer enough. Ed, of all people, was the one who surprised me. I'd expected him to defend his son, given everything I knew about the marriage he modeled for Tyler growing up. Instead, Carol told me later he'd gone quiet for most of that first week, and then said one thing to Tyler that Carol repeated to me almost word for word. "I did that to your mother for 30 years without a website telling me how. Don't you dare tell me this is different." It turned out Marcus, the coworker from the Waterloo branch, whose texts had made Tyler laugh privately months earlier, had been in the Providence Circle too, under a different handle, which explained a great deal about that laugh in retrospect. He transferred to a different regional office not long after the forum came up in conversation at Brannigan Freight, before anyone official had reason to ask him about it directly. Nobody made him leave. He just went quietly, the way men in that particular corner of the internet tend to when the lights come on. Denise Ferraro heard about the forum from Brett, who mentioned it in passing at the office office without fully understanding the scope of what he was setting off. HR opened a real inquiry this time, not the informal check-in from before. Not because anything Tyler did technically violated a workplace policy, since none of it had happened on company property, but because the forum posts referenced Denise, Craig, and the barbecue by enough identifying detail that it raised questions about what else he might have documented about coworkers and clients without their knowledge. Tyler wasn't fired. He also wasn't looked at the same way again. 2 people on his own sales team asked for reassignment to a different manager within the month, and Denise, according to Brett, started copying a second person into every email chain that involved Tyler, a small procedural change that told everyone in the office exactly how much trust remained. The district manager title stayed with Brett. Nobody in that office, as far as I ever heard, seriously questioned whether that had been the right call. Rachel Byrne sent the cease and desist letter 4 days after Carol's dinner, citing the hidden camera, the recorded audio of me on personal calls, and the forum post that used identifiable details about our shared address and my workplace. Tyler had the Providence Circle account deleted within 24 hours of receiving it, and Grant Holloway's whole operation, I later learned, quietly went dark about 6 weeks after that, following what looked like several similar letters arriving from several other directions at once. I like to think mine wasn't the only one. I doubt very much that it was. The mutual friend group chat, a thread that had existed since college called simply The Crew, fractured within a week of Carol's dinner, in a way that surprised me with how little I actually cared once it happened. 2 people Tyler had known since high school sided with him outright, arguing in the thread that I'd humiliated him in front of his whole family, and that whatever he'd done couldn't have been that bad if I was willing to wait 9 days before saying anything. I didn't defend myself in the thread. Priya, who'd been added to it years earlier as my +1 and never quite left, screenshotted the exchange and sent it to me privately with a single line. Some people will always choose the version of the story that costs them the least to believe. I left the group without a message. Jason left 2 days later, quietly, no announcement, just gone from the thread the next time anyone scrolled up. My own parents' reaction, when I finally told them the whole thing on a Sunday call, rather than the partial version I'd given my mother from the guest room, was quieter than I expected. My father, a man who fixes his own everything and has never in his life said a sentence longer than necessary, listened to the entire account without interrupting once, and then said only, "Bring the truck this weekend, we'll get your stuff." That was the whole conversation. It was, in its own way, exactly what I needed it to be. Moving out was its own particular kind of exhausting. We had 11 months left on the Maple Crest lease. Tyler wanted to keep the apartment and buy out my half of the furniture at what I documented, with photos and receipts, as roughly 60 cents on the dollar of what it was actually worth, an offer I declined through Rachel in a 2-line email that ended the negotiation within a day. There was also the matter of the $1,200 security deposit, which Tyler initially insisted should be returned entirely to him since his name came first on the lease, and the $640 still sitting in a joint house fund savings account we'd opened together for a down payment we'd never gotten close to needing. Rachel handled both in the same letter, citing the 60-40 split we'd maintained on every bill for 14 months, bank statements attached as proof. Tyler's lawyer, a friend of Ed's who mostly did contract work for the equipment dealership, folded on both points within a week, rather than let it become a documented dispute that might end up, however unofficially, part of the same paper trail as everything else. The one real fight was over Pepper, our gray tabby, who'd been mine before Tyler and mine after him too, a fact he seemed to genuinely forget in the moment he tried to argue that Pepper had bonded more with him. Carol, unexpectedly, was the one who settled it, telling her son over the phone, loud enough that I could hear it from across her kitchen, that he did not get to keep the one thing in that apartment that had never once needed to perform anything for him. Tyler's desperate moves came in a predictable order, the same order I imagine they always come in. First, the texts. Long, looping, apologetic paragraphs sent at 1 in the morning, invoking 3 years of memories, a version of himself he swore he could still become if I gave him one more chance. One of them ran to 9 separate messages, the last of which read only, "I don't even recognize the guy in those posts anymore," as if Grant Holloway and the Providence Circle were a costume he'd woken up wearing, rather than something he'd sought out and paid for and updated diligently, month after month for over a year. I didn't respond to any of them. Priya suggested I block the number outright, and I almost did, but some part of me, the same part I think, that had once kept a receipt with his number on it for 3 years, wanted to let the messages sit there unanswered, a record of their own, in case I ever needed to remember exactly how it ended, and not just how it began. Then the appearance in the Linwood parking lot one Thursday evening, standing by my car in the fading light, asking if we could just talk. No pressure, just talk. In a voice that had none of the cold calculation from that morning, with the laptop and all of the genuine, unrehearsed desperation of a man watching the last domino fall. I told him, standing there with my keys already in my hand, that I didn't have anything left to say that Carol's dining room hadn't already covered. He didn't come back a second time. Then the last move, the one that told me everything I needed to know about what kind of ending this actually was. A mutual friend reported back that Tyler had started telling people quietly that I'd set the whole thing up to embarrass him, that the sink, the wedding, all of it had been my plan from the very beginning to make him look bad in front of his family. I understood hearing that even now, even after everything, he still could not sit with the plain, unglamorous truth of what he'd done. He needed a version where I was the architect and he was the victim, because the real version, a man who paid $2,400 to learn how to break someone down and then panicked when she noticed, was apparently unbearable to him even in private. I let myself grieve once, properly, the week I packed the last of my boxes out of the Maple Crest apartment. Not for the folder, not for the forum, not even for the barbecue or the sink. For the version of that first year I still remember clearly, and without any bitterness at all. The receipt with his number on it, the warm gray paint he agonized over for a week, the way he used to laugh, really laugh, at my terrible torque spec jokes before he ever needed a coach to tell him what to want from me instead. I sat on the floor of the empty second bedroom with a box of old photographs in my lap, and I cried for maybe 20 minutes, not because I wanted him back, but because something had genuinely existed once, before the blueprint took over, and it was allowed to be mourned even though I was the one who'd chosen, deliberately and without regret, to end it. There was a photo near the bottom of the box, taken maybe 4 months in, of the two of us on the floor of this exact apartment before we owned a couch, eating pizza out of the box, both of us laughing at something I can no longer remember. I kept that one. I threw out most of the others, but I kept that one, and I put it in a drawer instead of a frame, which felt, at the time, like the most honest place for it to live. I live about 2 miles from Maple Crest now, in a 1-bedroom apartment near the river with a wobbly radiator. I fixed myself the first week I moved in, and Pepper sleeping in a patch of sun on the windowsill most afternoons. I still work at Linwood. Priya and I still get coffee most Fridays, usually from the same shop with the same barista, who still writes little notes on my cup, and I've stopped flinching at the ones that say something kind. Carol calls me on my birthday. Jason and I are still friendly, in the loose, occasional way of people whose real connection was always through someone else. Brett, for what it's worth, turned out to be exactly as decent as he seemed at that dinner table, and nothing more than a friendly neighbor a few doors down in a different building now. I never wanted a rescue, and to his credit, once he understood that, he never offered to be one again. I got a promotion of my own about 7 months after I moved out. Lead engineer on the Waterloo conveyor line. I'd been doing tolerance checks on the day I met Tyler in that hardware store, which felt, when the offer letter came through, like a small and unnecessary kind of poetry I hadn't asked for but didn't mind receiving. I fixed the radiator in my new apartment with a bleed key I already owned. I fixed a wobbling ceiling fan for the woman in the unit below me last spring, unprompted, because she mentioned it in the elevator and I had a stepladder and 40 minutes to spare, and it never once occurred to me, doing it, that there was anything about the task that required apologizing for. Carol still sends a card every year on the anniversary of the day I moved into Maple Crest, which is a strange date to mark, I know, but I understand what she means by it. Ed, the last time I saw him, at a chance run-in at Denny's Hardware of all places, told me, gruffly, standing in the same paint aisle where I'd once met his son, that he hoped I'd found someone who didn't need instructions. I told him I wasn't in a hurry to find anyone at all right now, and he nodded like that was the correct answer, and we didn't talk about Tyler. He bought a gallon of the warm gray paint on his way out, the same color Tyler had agonized over years earlier, and told me his own kitchen had needed a refresh for a while. I didn't ask if he meant anything by it. I don't think he did. Some things are just paint. People ask me sometimes when I tell pieces of this story whether I regret giving Tyler exactly what he asked for. I don't, not really, though I understand why it looks like a strange kind of revenge from the outside, cold, methodical, almost cruel in its patience. But I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it because I finally understood that a man who demands you become smaller has already told you, plainly, what he thinks you're worth, and the only honest response to that is to show him precisely what smaller looks like and let him live inside the consequences of his own request. He wanted feminine. I gave him feminine, completely without irony, exactly as specified. What he never accounted for was that a person who is only permitted to be soft and grateful and helpless is also, necessarily, a person other people start protecting, defending, wanting to rescue, and that the story of who broke her stops belonging, at some point, to the man who thought he was writing it. Something real was lost in that apartment on 3rd Avenue SE. I want to say that clearly, because I think stories like mine get told sometimes as pure triumph, and that's not honest. I loved him for a long time, before I ever learned there was a folder with my name on it. That love doesn't stop being real just because the man underneath it turned out to be building something in the dark the entire time. I let myself keep that grief. I just didn't let it keep me. I gave him exactly what he asked for. In the end, that was the only thing I ever needed to do.